Bună seara la o nouă ediție a emisiunii ContraCultura. Vitalie Sprînceanu mă numesc. Astăzi sunt onorat să-l am ca oaspete pe distinsul profesor Jan Tomasz Gross de la Universitatea din Princeton. Domnul Gross s-a născut în 1947 în Polonia, în familia unor membri ai rezistenței poloneze antifasciste. În anul 1968, după participarea sa la protestele și mișcările studențești din Polonia, și ca urmare a unei campanii antisemite a fost nevoit să plece în Statele Unite, acolo unde predă și astăzi. Domnul Jan Gross este autor de cărți care tratează memoria colectivă a Holocaustului, responsabilitatea populațiilor locale pentru executarea Holocaustului. Voi menționa câteva dintre cărțile lui care au stârnit discuții, polemici și care au schimbat perspectiva de abordare a genocidului evreilor din anii celui de-al doilea război mondial. Astfel, cartea Vecinii din 2001 povestește despre masacrul populației evreiești de către localnicii polonezi în orașul Jedwabne. În altă carte a sa, Frica, apărută în 2006, Jan Tomasz Gross vorbește despre un alt masacru al populației evreiești care s-a petrecut în orașul Kielce în 1946, imediat după război, într-un context în care populația locală poloneză a masacrat câteva zeci de evrei care se întorceau din lagările de concentrare. Ultima sa carte, care de altfel și prilejul aflării dumisale aici, Recolta de aur, în 2012, vorbește despre schimburile economice dintre administrația lagărilor de concentrare și populația locală poloneză pe seama evreilor în jurul lagărilor de concentrare. Cartea a fost tocmai tradusă la editura Nestor din Sankt Petersburg, a fost tradusă în limba rusă de domnul Monsionjnic și e, de fapt, prilejul pe care l-a adus pe domnul Gross în Republica Moldova. Pentru că domnul Gross nu vorbește română, această emisiune o facem în următoarea, de ce urmează. Discuția va fi în engleză și o vom subtitra. Vă invit să rămâneți alături de noi. Professor Gross, welcome to Chișinău.
Thank you very much.
It's an honor, as I would say, like, to have you here in the city, and it's a personal honor for me to have you here in this studio. I've read some of your books, and I have to acknowledge that I was, like, impressed would be the wrong word, but I was really impressed, and that challenged me and that inspired me to ask some questions.
You're too kind. Thank you very much for your introduction and for these nice words.
Is the occasion for you being here is the translation of your book, The Golden Harvest, in Russian. It appeared, like it was first appeared in 2012. Can you tell our viewers very shortly, in up to 3 minutes maybe, or like how do you feel it? What is the book about? Because I can do it myself, but then I will retell your book, and it's it's a pity when you have the author here.
Yeah. Well, this is a short book, relatively speaking, which was inspired by the writing of it, by a photograph of a very dramatic photograph which I have seen published in a newspaper, in Polish main daily newspaper, in the context of discussion of my previous book, which I had written. And what struck me at the time was that when the photograph was published, then there was really no response from the public.
Silence.
Yes, no, nobody picked up this issue. It's a photograph that illustrates excavations on the site of an extermination camp for precious items by the people are standing essentially on a pile of ashes, and we know that this is where several hundred thousands of Jews had been killed and stripped of everything. But in several sites of such mass executions in Eastern Europe, afterwards, local population for years was digging through it, and this, for me, this was a very powerful image, symbolic of the and communicating in a very dramatic way the experience of, if you will, distancing and casting away of Jewish population by their local neighbors in these areas at the time when they faced the greatest peril of all. So I decided to write a book around it, and The Golden Harvest is the result of it. We wrote it together with my wife.
Miss Irena Gruzinska.
Irena Gruzinska-Gross, yes. We collaborated on several books earlier on, and then this was our latest.
It's probably not the most original question, but I've read some book reviews, but also some sources available, mostly in English, because my Polish is still very bad. And one of the critiques that you've received for writing the book was this debate about how usual was this practice. Was just a kind of isolated case or was a generalized practice? And you make the case in the book that it was more or less a generalized practice, something that was kind of usual in the very unusual, abnormal way.
The way you phrase the question, one could think that it's the question about digging through mass graves. This is not...
Yeah, and I should make a short, a note, in a way, a footnote, that you talk not only about that, but you talk also about the economic exchanges that happened during the war. So it was a long process. During the war, but also after the war. So there is this constant, I don't know how to put it, because it's like, as you mentioned also in the book, it's like our language is not used or to describe these situations in the normal, using the normal words. It's like we're facing such a terrible experience where the subject of exchange are things that it's like the most sacred, like human life, like human beings.
Yeah. Well, with respect to this very striking phenomenon of digging through the sites of mass murder, this is a universal phenomenon, and there were many sites of such mass murder, though extermination camps, Treblinka, Bełżec, Sobibór, were the most drastic ones, given the volume and the number of people who had been killed there. But mass executions had taken place of Jews all over the area. Many Jews lived in Eastern Europe, as you know, and actually the peculiarity of the Holocaust in this region was that so many of them had been killed not in extermination camps, but actually very close, at the site of where they lived. So in the vicinity of and in complete transparency and visibility to the local population.
You're anticipating one of my future questions, because in the book you make this affirmation that up to 1/4 of the total number of Jews killed during the Holocaust have been killed not by Einsatz commandos or in concentration camps, but by the local population in these areas where they lived.
Well, I was not even referring to this now. The killings in local areas were done very often by the police. It could be, the police could be brought, it could be German gendarmes, but it could be also a kind of auxiliary police that has been created from among the local population, naturally. Local killings, in fact, in many instances, it was the German gendarmerie or these special troops that were mainly responsible. Yes, local people were involved in the most drastic acts of murder and also spoliation. In other words, a kind of a robbery of Jewish property throughout the area, and it's a quasi-universal phenomenon wherever Jews were. This is what has happened, and it's well documented. enough Jews survived to later tell the story. But also, the local population told the story. For example, in my earlier book that I wrote on the subject of a killing in the town of Jedwabne that took place in July of 1941, immediately after Germany has attacked the Soviet Union, and that part of Poland had been initially occupied by the Soviet troops in the town of Jedwabne. This particular episode happened. The main documentation that illustrates and gives detailed information about the killing of Jewish population of that town, some 1,600 people, comes and is produced during a trial that takes place after the war of some of the perpetrators, just a few of them, but most of the details are given by those Poles who were involved in the killings, Jews who were dead by them.
But that, in a way, also highlights another side of the debate. Most of the time, apologists or denialists in this part of the world, they say that the local populations didn't know. And that contradicts it. They were like your account on the participation of local populations on the everyday economic exchanges that they did around the camps contradicts the story that the locals didn't know. They perfectly knew what's happening. They perfectly were aware of what's there and what's it for.
Yeah, frankly, the only version in which I heard that people didn't know, so to speak, was later on, after the war, spawned stories about allegedly German, regular German, so to speak, German society, not being aware of what was going on this far away in the East, etc., etc. Also, of course, a canard. People in Germany, from a certain point on, knew very well.
Yeah, there was a whole controversy after the book by Daniel Goldhagen, and other people wrote about that. And
but in Eastern Europe, I must say, I've, at least in Poland, I've never heard from anyone that, as an argument that would put on some kind of a thesis that the local population just was not involved, that people didn't know what happened to Jews. Of course they knew it was happening all around. Everybody could see it with their own eyes. The argument, of course, would be put forth that they did not participate in it, that there were only just a few marginal groups and kind of this criminal element that was involved. But otherwise, people were busy and concerned with their own affairs, which were hard and difficult enough, you know.
Yeah,
but that's also patently untrue.
I'm kind of divided now because I have two big questions coming from the book. From the logic of our conversation, probably the big question would be why? Why the local populations did why they did? Why they took willingly, enthusiastically part in this terrible endeavor?
You know, I don't have a good answer to this question, but besides saying that human nature is such that people are prepared to do cruel things to other people, especially if there is a group groups that live side by side and have this very deeply entrenched negative stereotype about the so-called other. And of course, anti-Semitism is a sustained and always everywhere present in Eastern Europe, not only in Eastern Europe, in Western Europe as well, up to the Second World War. Point of view, if you will. It was very, very much cultivated by religious institutions, and there was a kind of a...
by political elites also?
Of course, political elites, etc. So wherever you look, you know, whether it's Poland or France or Romania, before the war, you'll find anti-Semites, very articulated anti-Semitic positions present in social discourse. So in that sense, the local population is quite prepared to just consider Jews as an alien element that needs to be eliminated.
If I may interrupt you for just a short...
Sure.
Moreover, we've had, or not we, but there were pogroms in this part of the world before the war, long before, in Poland, in Ukraine, in Chisinau. Chisinau was the site of one of the biggest pogroms in 1903, so it's not that out of blue sky.
So in fact, even radical violence was endemic in these areas, and you didn't need German inspiration for it. But of course, what happens during the time of the Second World War and German occupation, I'm talking about Poland, German occupation. Romania was not under a German occupation, but similar things happened here, inspired to a large extent by the Nazis, of course, but actually things were going on even before the Nazis appeared here and drew Romania into the war against the Soviet Union. It's enough to think of these extraordinarily brutal pogroms in Bucharest in January of 1941. But that's beside the point for the moment. What I want to say is this, that first of all, the anti-Semitism is just something that's extraordinarily dangerous. And it gives people a certain frame of mind which can very quickly be radicalized.
But also persistent. I was reading your biography, and there is this ironical, tragical, and paradoxical kind of feature that your parents, like your father, was part of the underground, or your parents were part of the underground, and your father...
My mother was.
And they were subjected, like your mother protected your father in a way, or at least that, and they were subjected to anti-Semitism. And then you yourself, in another context, were also subject of anti-Semitic campaign, as I understand, that happened in Poland in the 60s. So you have this feature, anti-Semitism, being very easily, and I don't know, I'm speculating now, I'm not a historian, I assume all the subjectivity and exaggerations that can be, but like it seems to me that is very easily, in a way, being carried from one system to another, despite their pretensions that they're building a new man, they're building something new. So it's kind of this, I would add to this probably the patriarchy and the patriarchal domination, but it's one of these structural features of society in a way that is being very easily carried away from one system to another.
This is what you're referring to is really a very interesting phenomenon that within the context of communist regimes also, something which was imposed on Poland and after the Second World War, communist regimes which are grounded in ideology of internationalism, of course, yes, it's just presumably ethnic differences don't make or of no significance. It's only class difference that accounts for conflict in society. But so-called in real socialism, ethnic prejudices and hatred was very often used by the communist authorities to manage and to organize their power. And indeed, in the case of Poland or, for example, Soviet Union, Stalin was in the late 1940s vociferous, but for the fact of his death, I'm sure that even more tragic experiences would affect the Jewish community in the Soviet Union. But in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in that case, indeed, anti-Semitism became a kind of a underlying element of this ideological campaign that was launched by a certain segment of the Communist Party, avowedly against, it was anti-Zionist campaign, etc., but it really evoked this sort of impetus of anti-Semitic sentiment in the society.
We'll be back shortly after a small break. Rămâneți cu noi. Bună seara din nou, revenim în studioul emisiunii ContraCultura, unde eu l-am ca oaspete pe distinsul profesor Jan Tomaș Gros și continuăm discuția cu dumnealui. Professor Gross, I would like to comment another aspect of your book that for me was revealing. And I think it's probably the biggest take from this book that I had, is this, there was in the study of the Holocaust, there is, it's a well-documented process already, the dehumanization of the victims. Like a lot has been written, how through language, through laws and through other practices, Jews were de-individualized, dehumanized, they transformed in something else than human beings. Mm-hmm. And you're approaching this, besides from this point, you're approaching it from another angle, which for me, like, I might be biased, I'm a little, like I'm on the left to say, and I see some similarities in our times, like the dehumanization of the human beings in terms of equating them with their property. And I'm not sure if I'm quoting you directly from from the book, but it's this sentence or this expression that I kind of keep in mind, the identification of the man with his property. And you mention it several times that for some local populations, like the Jews, were just a pair of boots or golden rings or jewelry or whatever.
Yeah. Well, you know, it was a very dramatic phenomenon to realize, and just because we can observe this process of destruction of the Jewish community from very close. There are these personal testimonies that have been preserved by Jews who had survived, mostly. I mean, that's the fundamental element here, on which initially at least that insight into Holocaust as a process which involved these very direct relationships between people is provided. But then later on, and this is I think a great success and a very important element of this new historiography of the Holocaust that had been written for the last 15 years or so in Poland in particular, that's in trials of perpetrators that have taken place, I must say infrequent. It's we only know a little bit of what has happened, but again, these sort of perpetrators or witnesses who not Jewish witnesses, they report a lot of conversations, a lot of statements that have been made and so forth. And this is a very powerful theme there, you know. It's just Jews are being perceived as, and this is also an element, it seems to me, of very standard and ancient anti-Semitic ideology. Jews and gold, Jews and a kind of amassing of property. That's one
you mentioned in the book this metaphor of the blood-sucking Jew, that it's metaphorically and sometimes it's taken literally. Yes. For example, for the pogrom in Chisinau, that was taken literally, that the Jews have killed one child and they have prepared their traditional Passover meal. But there is also this kind of metaphor about the Jews bloodsucker of the economy, of like kind of extracting the rent, the profits, the biggest.
I think great. This is there is a very important parallel here, and it really sticks together. This perception of Jews as usurers. Yes, the ones who loan money and then get these extraordinarily high profits from it, and they profit from us, as local populations would view it. So the blood-sucking in the sense, this metaphorical sense of economic exploitation, but also it goes very much parallel with this medieval prejudice that's being held in populations all over this area, frankly, until present times. There is a very important study that had been written by a wonderful anthropologist, Joanna Tokarska-Bakir in Poland, on the blood libel, on these legends of blood. It was a huge book, a big research with a group of students going out, done in 1990s, and it's it's still there. It's very, very much present, and it's certainly, just as in Chisinau in 1903, it worked in Kielce in 1946 as well. The very same absurd accusation, but it helps to organize these murderous violence against a group of people, to perceive them as, if you will, vampires who are
sucking the blood of the nation. The reason I think this is very important is it's like this economic, in a way, if economics means something in this context, but it's like in some radical versions, it's now you see this dehumanization at work, like people judged by only what they have, the possibilities that can afford. And for me, this is important to see how dangerous could be this economic dehumanization, where economics is just kind of rational, cold calculation about the profit without the other values being taken into account. And of course, this is an extreme case, but as another distinguished sociologist, Zygmunt Bauman, showed, it's part, in a way, of the rationalistic worldview, and it makes sense in a certain framework of rationality. And Hannah Arendt wrote in her wonderful book about Eichmann. It's the same. The guy was just like this. He was thinking that he is transporting goods, or this is kind of this mindset.
If I may add here, since you mentioned Eichmann, indeed, this whole process, in practical terms, is what was in Hitler's mind when he unleashed the fury of German policy of destruction of the Jews. That's something that's completely beyond anyone's imagination. But the kind of a systematic practice in the Third Reich of assault on the Jews was for a long time directed deliberately with the purpose of stripping Jews of their property. Eichmann develops his skills as a...
you mentioned he first trained with the property in Budapest.
Actually in Vienna.
Or in Vienna,
yeah. But this whole... He's the great organizer, and then divines logistical schemes of how to push Jews to emigrate from the Third Reich. They want to get rid of Jews from German society in a variety of ways. He is tasked with this matter, and a very important element of the whole process is to make the giving up of all the property by Jews who eventually will be given permission to emigrate, to make this, the stripping Jews of property, a part of the process. And as time goes by, it becomes more and more radical, so that by 1938 or so, after the Kristallnacht, when the big wave of Jewish emigration comes, literally people become destitute just by essentially Eichmann and his team.
This book, but also your books, they start and they uncover some realities that happened in the past. You don't invent things. And then I was following the so-called controversy, like the discussion around the books, and there is it's paradoxical that you uncover something that was hidden, that was kept silent, and you would expect that after that you'll have some soul searching, some kind of self-reflection, and instead you have denial or other. And I'm following now I'm trying to follow the events in Poland, and it's a very complicated situation where you state something, and then there is for some reason the government thinks that I think you've been accused of insulting the Poles in Poland. You've been interrogated by prosecutor for one of your declarations. Why? Why, in your opinion, this is happening?
Well, you raised several issues of significance, but let me say first that when these books were published, it all starts with the publication of this book on the Jedwabne neighbors. The issue generated two kinds of responses, one might say. I mean, a whole spectrum of responses, but there was an extraordinarily interesting and vivid discussion in the year 2000 and 2001, immediately after publication, shortly after publication of Neighbors, where becoming aware and recognizing that this horrendous thing has happened was very much a kind of a part of public discussion. A president of Poland at the time, Aleksander Kwaśniewski, there was a big event organized on the 60th anniversary of the Jedwabne murder in Jedwabne itself, a monument that was there which wrongly attributed the death of these Jews, of 1,600 Jews, to Germans, was removed. Another monument was put up. It didn't say exactly who killed these Jews, but at least it didn't have this false information. Kwaśniewski was there. By then, it was well known what has happened. There was this Polish Institute of National Memory instituted a big investigation that would last 2 years. And at the conclusion of that investigation, it said directly responsible for it were Poles. So it was kind of honestly confronted. There was always part of the public opinion that just went in complete denial. But essentially, the local memory, if you will, of these events was always completely transparent and clear. It didn't take long, as journalists who went there to Jedwabne found out, to have a conversation with the local person who would say, but of course, our people did it, we know it, everybody knows it. And actually, these kinds of killings were taking place all around. The Institute of National Memory, at that time, a wonderful institution that was really invested into investigation of what has actually happened, they published a 2-volume compendium. One was of documents, the other of various commentaries and essays of historians, demographers, legal experts around Jedwabne, it was called. And in the introduction to this volume, it starts with a statement saying, well, there were around 20 or so townships in this area, in this very area, in which actually mass killings of Jews by their Polish neighbors took place. Several of them even before German troops entered the area. So this was a time of great stock-taking, as it were, in an honest fashion, accompanied by denial that was articulated in a variety of ways and sort of defensive arguments, which I fully understand. This is a very difficult
truth to face.
Yes, to confront, especially in a society that has been so deeply victimized, both by German and by the Soviet occupation, which took place on the eastern half of Poland between 1939 and 1941, So suddenly, and there is a kind of a deeply ingrained memory of Poles as victims. And to think that Polish society, significant parts of it, have taken part also in persecution of another category of Polish citizens, namely Polish Jews, that was very difficult to square with this heroic narrative of the war. So it had to take some time, and it had to remain controversial. But as you rightly say, things have turned suddenly. And over the last period, and especially with this last government that came to power, which is rabidly nationalist and revisionist with respect of history. I mean, they are completely trying to rewrite history, and not only the history of the war. They want to rewrite the history of solidarity movement, for example, to expunge Lech Wałęsa and put in the twin brother of Kaczyński, you know, as a key figure of solidarity movement. I mean, total idiocies. But as far as wartime history goes, the same revisionism applies. Today, the man who was appointed by the Polish parliament to be the head of this Institute of National Memory, the very institution which carried out a very complex investigation that came up with this conclusion, this fellow, well, his name is Szarek, when he was queried, he had these interviews before a commission that ultimately would recommend him to the parliament, which voted him by votes of the ruling party. He would say, it's the Germans who have done the killings in Jedwabne. You know, I mean, totally blatant lie, first of all, and secondly, something which goes against the findings of the very institution at the head of which he's supposed to be put on. So it's a very, this sort of revisionism, I'm very sad to see it. To some extent, one of the consequences of it, in a very small part, was this intervention of the Polish procuracy that initiated, presumably, investigation against me for insulting the Polish nation, something which
after
I
you say
done.
that the Poles killed more Jews than the Germans, I think.
No, Poles killed more Jews than they killed Germans.
Yeah.
This is a very simple, you don't need to be a mathematical genius to compare numbers.
I would address you in a way the same question, but from a different angle. What has changed in the general public? Because the story of politicians taking opportunistically on historical issues or like addressing these issues of collective memory, it's very long and it's kind of... But on the other hand, why in the general public there is this widespread skepticism about history, about like historians writing books about history, and you have like a lot of like, I don't know, like I never thought that in my life I will see denialists going mainstream, and now you see it. It's
But
like,
you mean not only in Poland, in a variety
not only,
of places.
not only in Poland. I'm afraid to relate it to this discussion of post-truth, alternative facts, and so on and so forth. But there is this movement, or there is this kind of trend, a cultural trend, that you put science and you put some, I don't know, I don't want to offend any homeopaths, but you put something else, and it's like, yes, and they, for some reason, they hold valid, and people taking refuge in these kind of bubbles that, no, it was not. I was recently in Krakow, and I remember there was these pictures, the death camps were German, and there is a website people can go, and it's like, it's not only several marginal figures, but it's kind of entering the mainstream. Do you have a kind of speculative explanation why?
But you know, the death camps were a German
they were German
production. Yes, so it's in that sense, this is not a good example of a sort of revisionist history. No, I don't know exactly what to attribute it to. In the case of each society, it would be something different. I think it's very difficult to come to terms and take upon oneself as a collective entity that has continuity through history. I mean, sort of, we as Poles or Polish society, we think that we draw and the sense of identity from Polish history. So
But why only these pictures in black and white? It's like we cannot accept nuances.
Yes.
Yes, like your books don't say that all the Poles were perpetrators.
They
or
certainly
that
were not, yes.
Poland is not you didn't say that it is a nation of perpetrators. You just added nuances. Yes, there were the soldiers, but the local populations, there were some factors. You're trying to explain a very complex reality, which indeed was very complex in this part of the world. And I have read many conceptualizations like Bloodlands, Central European Civil War, and people trying to make sense out of this kind of violence that were in a way endemic. And why only in black and white? Either we accept it totally, either we deny it completely.
I think it's simpler intellectually to be
have this simplistic narrative.
to take a kind of awareness of just one aspect and say, oh, this is how it was. But why would one buy into a false narrative in such numbers? I mean, first of all, let me just contextualize it in the Polish case by saying that there is a significant and a very important phenomenon that's current, that goes on, and that's a historiography of the Holocaust, which is being produced by Polish scholars. And there is this center of study on Polish Jews during the war, on the Holocaust of Polish Jews at the Polish Academy of Science, which does fantastic work. And they've produced, a mountain of writings. And I'm really saying mountain because we had some 2 years ago, I think this was the 10th anniversary of the publication of a yearly, which is called Zagłada Żydów, Destruction of Jews, of Polish Jews, documents and articles. And if you put them together, it's really you can hide behind it, And this is not counting monographs, which historians affiliated with the center.
Professor Gross, we'll continue our discussion after another short break. Rămâneți cu noi, ne revedem după o scurtă pauză. Bună seara din nou, revenim în studioul ediției emisiunii ContraCultura, revenim la discuția cu profesorul Jan Tomasz Gross. Hello again.
Hello again.
It's my, how to say, last questions are more about the present than they, of course, look to the past, but it's more about the present. What are the ways to deal with this delicate, traumatic, collective memory in terms of, I don't know, maybe I've read a lot about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. How to deal? Are there any examples in Central Europe of a good dealing with that past?
Let me say first, I think it's easier to say how one thinks this past should be dealt with, rather than to give examples necessarily of good ways of dealing. Though actually there are some examples of, and I'll come to it in a second. It seems to me that the Holocaust in particular is such a big event and such a dramatic story in Eastern Europe. It's a dramatic story with respect to all of Western civilization, if you will. This big question mark, how an idea of this sort could come from the kind of a cultural framework which produces, Goethe, Hegel, Schiller, Beethoven, etc., etc. Goodness, this is really a situation which I think will have to be rethought and revisited forever. Every generation will have to think about it. So it's a key phenomenon in Western civilization canon, in the canon of, but specifically it's a key episode, if you will, in the history, in 20th century history of countries where it actually happened, on the territories of which it actually happened. So one cannot escape it. If you're a Pole, you'll forever have to
to deal
Ask
with
yourself
this.
a question. What happened to Polish Jews? You know, it's just in
The
Chisinau.
same with Chisinau, yeah.
50% of this population of Chisinau were Jews until 1939. Now, Chisinauans that live here today, if they want to have a proper sense of their own identity, if they want to know who they are, where they come from, what is the kind of a sense of the place in which they live, they must ask themselves that question too. And they must themselves, therefore, acquire a certain kind of knowledge about what it meant for the city to be multicultural. And multicultural with this Jewish component so pronounced. If they don't know it, they don't know who they are. And the same you can tell about inhabitants of every, practically, township in East Central Europe, and of every East Central European country. So, in that sense, it seems to me we cannot escape this history. Now, what do we do with it? Unless we confront it honestly, we will never be comfortable about ourselves. Because this is our past, you know? If you think by analogy of individual biography, if you've done something when you were of that magnitude in your past, you may wish to forget about it.
But it will be with you.
But the experience tells us that you will end up on the couch of a psychiatrist very soon. You cannot construct your identity in life by abstracting. It's the same as it would be obvious to everybody that Germans could not abstract. They have a very long history from what has happened between 1933 and 1945 in their country. It would make lives of Germans much easier, perhaps, to say, oh, well, this was just, let's forget about it. It cannot be done. And actually, if you ask me about honest dealing with that difficult past, the most difficult past concerning the Holocaust, in that sense, of course, belongs to Germany. Yeah. This is where the idea was invented, and that's where the organizers of this horrendous crime came from, and the perpetrators, and the main perpetrator. And perhaps that's why this was a society that didn't have a way out. It took a generation, you know, 1940s, 1950s, maybe until mid-1960s, not much was happening. But then it became a very important element in the understanding of what is the civic responsibility of politicians, of teachers, of the school system. Today, it's a country and it's a society which, better than any other society in Europe, and we have a very good example of it, a very good test, by observing attitude towards refugees from the Middle East, people who en masse are trying to save themselves.
You're anticipating my next question.
Yeah.
It was about the refugees, in a way.
Yes.
You wrote an article for Project Syndicate, and it's, for me, the aha moment came, or like the same questions we are facing here. Last year we had a presidential election. In this country, the president is rather a decorative figure, but the electoral campaign was very fierce. At one point in this campaign, there emerged the narrative about the 30,000 Syrian refugees that supposedly would come to Moldova if one of the candidates was elected. And it was this sheer amount of rhetorical violence, fears, xenophobia, whatever. It's like, no, we don't want them, we don't accept them. And for me, it was in a way a schizophrenic situation, because on the one hand, this country, Moldova, is one of the main one of the biggest senders of immigrants around Europe today. And this is on the one hand. Almost every Moldovan has somebody from his or her family that is living in a different context, all around the world, all around the world. And on the other hand, the same nation or the same society has these huge fears that 30,000 refugees, that some Syrian refugees will come and will alter somehow their values or whatever they think as a national identity. And I was very surprised and pleasantly surprised to see in that your contribution the same parallel. You have a society that was victim of serious military machines. It's like that gave refugees. It's like in the US, in Canada, all over the place. And the same country now, it's like boasting that will not accept refugees, that will not accept anyone, that will defend our country, will protect the borders and everything. And besides that, in terms of, I don't know how to put the question, but it's in this way, I see this link between the unwillingness to accept a certain past and the unwillingness to deal with present situations that require from you this kind of attitude, empathy, solidarity.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I'm so glad that you mentioned it, and you mentioned it in a way in which I was thinking about it. You know, when it was in 2015, where the issue, it also came in the context of the elections very much. But I mean, it was there even before, and in Poland. And, you know, when I was reading about it, I got really furious, precisely because Eastern Europe in general, in Poland in particular, this is where my heart is invested, so to speak. This is what I know. This is the history of society that I'm concerned about and knowledgeable. And suddenly, this, you know, Poles for 200 years were emigrating all the time for a variety of reasons, economic reasons, political reasons. I mean, this is the fate of exile, is emblematic, symbolic of the fate of a Pole, of a Polish patriot. The greatest Polish poetry has been written by exiles who couldn't...
from Gombrowicz to...
From Mickiewicz, you know,
yeah.
to Gombrowicz and Miłosz and others. My goodness, and this society responds in such a fashion because what was striking, it was not simply that there were some cynical politicians who are playing on xenophobic sentiments. Actually, there was a kind of a consensus across political lines, you know. The main newspaper in Poland, I mentioned this in this article which I wrote,
Gazeta
Wyborcza, which has, as many newspapers, allows for readers' comments to articles that it publishes, had to ban and institute a prohibition on any comments whatsoever in the context of articles about refugees. And it said so because the content of these comments was just so
hate speech.
Horrendous, hate speech. Well, that tells you something about a kind of a general mood of society. And I thought that this is an issue that should be addressed directly by politicians and in a manner that would make people aware how profoundly unpatriotic, if you will, and un-Polish this was. It was a betrayal of a very profound tradition. You know, there is a watchword, a slogan that comes from a Romantic period, from the time of these greats, when Poland did not exist as a state because it was dismembered.
And it was only the idea of Poland.
And if you will, the idea of Poland, it existed in the spiritual space. But the notion that Poles are these defenders of liberty wherever liberty is threatened, za naszą wolność I waszą. You know, we fight for liberation everywhere. This is who we are. And this sort of reaction suddenly, when people are threatened with, we can observe what's going on over there, how incredibly destructive is this war in the Middle East, how brutal are
Yeah, we see every day.
religious fanatics who are and local dictators. You know, Assad is not a religious fanatic; he's the opposite of it. But he is a first-class murderer also. And we see this population that runs away in just atrocious circumstances. You know, thousands of people drowning on these boats that don't hold them. You know, families, children. I mean, is this a kind of a opportunistic immigration? The people who are trying to move in and in order to take our jobs? This is so cynical and horrendous on the part of the Polish establishment.
It's terrible. I'm also seeing with a lot of sadness how people cannot relate to the most basic human characteristics when the life as such is being endangered. You see like children that you can argue, and there is like you can argue that the ISIS terrorist will infiltrate or not, you can do, but it's children, it's women, it's old elderly, it's regular people that have lived regular lives and looking for shelter in the same way other populations have looked for shelter, including the Poles, but Moldovans also were looking for shelters, which in a way, I don't know, it's a kind of gives you a very pessimistic view of human history. That slogan, it will never happen again, or it's kind of, it's more not a wishful thinking, but it's more of a project than an objective reality, because the reality, whatever social reality we have around us, gives you hints almost every day that it can happen again. That is, it has happened actually again.
It has happened again, first of all. And but to add to your observations, I mean, first of all, this is a very sorry state of human moral sensibility, if you will, in general, that one observes and is registered here. But I want to stress here again, it seems to me that politicians in this part of the world had plenty of opportunities through history to learn that prejudice and hatred, if it is, whether it's class hatred, ethnic hatred, religious hatred, when mobilized and by ruthless politicians, can lead to absolutely devastating consequences. And that it is therefore the responsibility of politicians nowadays, especially in the case of Poland. They are part of the European Union. Goodness sake, you know, we were all trying to finally move from east to west, if you will, in that geopolitical configuration that had been imposed since the war on the European continent. And certain values are binding, presumably, in that European project. It's the responsibility of politicians to be very careful and to tame these instincts that people unavoidably have of thinking about themselves and not having an open mind about others. And they should cultivate and inculcate a sense of tolerance, of understanding, of empathy,
solidarity.
And of just, this is what the religious faith is also all about in its proper, it seems to me, formula, you know, that there is, but it's been all cast away, and I'm speaking of Poland now, by these cynical politicians, brutally and very primitively nationalistic in the way, and xenophobic in the way they formulate, and they kind of build the basis on which they hold on to power. And of course, it finds there is a constituency that responds to it. And unfortunately in Poland also, now one can hear more informed voices of various Catholic bishops on this issue. But the kind of a rank and file Catholic Church personnel, and embodied in Poland again, we have a very good example how to gauge the sentiment there. There's this awful figure by the name of Rydzyk, who runs a big media empire, and you can read and observe Radio Maria or Nasz Dziennik and read what these hack journalists and various priests turned politicians have to say. This is a xenophobic, anti-Semitic, awful place where a lot of members, I'm afraid, of the clergy stand and whom they support, and this has a terrible impact and influence on
It's
the
very
state of
interesting.
mind.
You're making a very interesting observation in the sense that as society, as formal political society, there are some mechanisms to deal with this traumatic past, and there were some processes, some trials. But on the other hand, for example, the church is one of the main repositories of this hatred and of anti-Semitism, kind of came, I don't know, unquestioned, so to speak, and it's. I wouldn't make too big parallels between Moldova and Poland. It's totally different situations, but there have been enough examples of anti-Semitism without Jews. That's the norm of anti-Semitism today here in this country, like no Jews, and it comes. And bringing back to our discussion about anti-Semitism, now is bringing back with Soros, with other conspiracy theories. And you're completely right about the role of politicians that have this role to lead, to inspire, to build, to imagine these big communities where we show empathy to each other, to make us dream in a way, like dream of bigger, inclusive projects. But they unfortunately are as they are. They're dividing in order to keep this small sector of power that they have. And they are using fear. And unfortunately, that's not only, how to put it, it's not only an Eastern European or Central European feature. Like you're living in the US, as I remember in the political campaign, fear of any kind, immigrants, Mexicans, Muslims. What was used also an amplifier of people's.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, we have to finish here. It was a big pleasure for me to have you here. I hope that your book will find and will have a lot of readers here that will ask these questions, so that maybe in the future we'll have more informed conversations with people that are honest to assume some inconvenient or traumatic parts of the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Doamnelor și domnilor, vă mulțumim că ați fost alături de noi. Ne revedem săptămâna viitoare. La revedere, o seară bună!